Ladies and gentlemen, hello, welcome to DC News. Thanks for joining us here in Outlook, live from Bucharest, today with a very special guest from Cape Town, with Professor Howard Phillips. Howard, welcome to DC News. How are you?
Thank you, very well indeed. The fear of a return of COVID hangs over us all, but for the moment, there are not a large number of cases in South Africa that we know about. But of course, as you know, with COVID, you turn away for a little time and things can change dramatically.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me please, first of all, introduce you my very special guest today, Professor Howard Phillips. Professor Phillips taught medical history at the University of Cape Town for centuries. You held a PhD in medical history in the Spanish flu from the University of London, if I'm not mistaken. So you have the competence and also the vast knowledge and also the experience to talk today with me about similarities between the pandemic at the turn of the 20th century with COVID nowadays. But also, thanks for taking care and mentioning the rising cases of COVID. We are talking from a sunshine country. You are in the middle of the summer almost in Cape Town, but cases are rising here in chilly, cold winter Europe.
Yeah, and China is what we read about.
That's true. Howard, may I ask you please, what inspired you already in the 70s to investigate this very severe disease, which started almost at the end of World War I?
Radu, I must be completely honest. I stumbled upon it. I did not know about it. I was a postgraduate student in history at London University, and some of the work I was doing there as part of the coursework related to what was then quite a new approach, and that is looking at the domestic side of warfare. And I began looking at the domestic side of World War I. In Britain, there was a fair amount of written new work, exciting work. And then when I got back to South Africa, I thought, well, let me ask the same question. What was happening in South Africa internally during World War I? We know a great deal about the military, but what about domestic? What about civilians? And as I began to read the contemporary newspapers, particularly I got to 1918, I began to read about a worrying outbreak of influenza. And I thought, well, I don't know about this, let me read a little bit more. And the more I read, the more I realized that South Africa, together with most other countries in the world, had been plunged into a crisis of unprecedented proportions by World War I and by the Spanish flu, which came at the end of the war. And I thought, well, it's interesting. There doesn't seem to be much written about it in South Africa or elsewhere for that matter. Maybe I'll do a little bit of research and I'll write an article. Well, I knew very little. And as I began to do the more research, so I realized this was a huge topic which has been untouched, of enormous, devastating, catastrophic proportions. And what would have been perhaps a short little article of interest turned into a doctoral study. And fortunately, in the 1970s, when I began this, there was still quite a large number of elderly people who had lived through the Spanish flu as teenagers. And so I began to interview them and did quite a lot of collecting of oral evidence. And that only deepened my understanding of the horror of what the Spanish flu had been to experience. And so from a stumble came a doctoral thesis and a book and a lifelong examination, not just of the Spanish flu, but then of epidemics generally, because what I realized is that, and as we know it so well from COVID, from HIV/AIDS, what epidemics do is subject societies to what you might call a stress test. They put the pressure on the society, and all the weaknesses and flaws and shortcomings and problems within a society are intensified by that. They come up to the surface. They show up much more sharply and starkly. And so I realized that the study of epidemics was indeed not just for doctors, not just for medical researchers, but also a very neglected dimension for historians, particularly social historians, historians of medicine, historians of everything, because as again, we know too well from COVID, everything is touched directly or indirectly by a severe epidemic.
Howard, well, you said you stumbled basically over the Spanish flu, but have you ever given a thought that you might stumble over your PhD thesis a second time during your life?
Yeah, it is a very strange experience to be writing about an epidemic in the midst of another epidemic. And indeed,
that must be amazing. I mean, what a surprise.
Absolutely.
Almost like a déjà vu, I believe.
Yeah, it's a déjà vu.
Was that something surprising you? Or you thought, let's see what I have written almost 50 years ago? I mean, you're certainly are familiar with your PhD thesis, yeah. But I'm sure that it stirred your interest once more to look at some facts which do seem to resemble with what we were experiencing during COVID pandemic, isn't it?
I'm going to take your question and widen my answer even further, if you don't mind.
Please.
What I realized as I began to experience firsthand the pandemic of COVID is that pandemics, as I said, show up things in a society, whether we're talking about COVID, Spanish flu, HIV/AIDS, smallpox, polio, all of those show up as aspects of a society which otherwise are not so obvious. And what was apparent to me is that COVID was doing exactly the same. COVID was showing up all the fissures, all the flaws, all the imbalances, all the weaknesses in society as previous had done. And so, in a sense, I began to stand back a little from the Spanish flu and from COVID and say, well, are these features of any human society under the pressure, under the duress of an acute epidemic? And indeed, there are quite a number of parallels which I can trace because, I subsequently went on in the early 2000s to write a book called Epidemics, looking at the 5 worst epidemics in South African history: smallpox, bubonic plague, polio, Spanish flu, HIV/AIDS. And that's where these patterns, these similarities, these almost standard responses began to make themselves apparent to me. And then when COVID appeared, I said, I've seen this all before. Obviously, there are changes. Obviously, there are variations. They're not carbon copy replications, but there are enough similarities to make me say, but that's how human societies respond in this way and in that way.
I think the term of stress test is a very suitable one. It's very appropriate because it implies a stressful moment. So obviously, the stress refers to severe difficulties a society is experiencing during such a pandemic. And whatever is stressful is also a chance to give rise to all sorts of characters and aspects which one otherwise would definitely not encounter, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. In some ways, one of my colleagues said, it's like turning on a bright light in a dark room. It suddenly reveals a lot of things which were there, but which you didn't see.
I found it extremely interesting reading a chapter in your PhD thesis about media. Media has played a key role in during the Spanish flu, as it did during COVID. And looking at media, how it was writing about the Spanish flu in rural South Africa, how it was writing about the Spanish flu in urban South Africa, how the information was then perceived by the readers. I found that very challenging because one aspect we're dealing with nowadays, as apparently at least the South African society had been dealing with during the Spanish flu, was the narrative of the disease itself, then the narrative of the cause of the disease, what might have brought and caused the disease, and also conspiracy theories. So these three aspects are something I'd like to talk to you about, because the media at a certain extent also shows the mainstream, refers to the mainstream of a society, otherwise we would have definitely not written about it. So this shows us what people were interested in at least reading about, isn't it?
Yes, the communication environment today with COVID is, of course, vastly different. There are many more opportunities for ordinary people to make their feelings known, to express their fears, to express their anxieties. And one issue which is not really going to face me, but which is going to face historians of the future, is how do they even access this massive amount of material on social media with regard to COVID, and how do they make sense of that? They are going to run the risk of drowning in that amount of information. Back in 1918, the media was exclusively the press, and the press had a number of roles, and one of those was to try and provide some kind of guidance in the absence of any well-organized public health department of central government. The media often served as the way in which information, critical information, was conveyed to a wide public. So the media reported on what was happening, but also had a role which was to actually provide medical information, relief information. So that's perhaps a little different. Now you can be flooded by that kind of information on social media, but by and large, when state departments want to convey that information, they use social media, not the standard mainstream press.
But that was the only source of information back then.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as you all know, if I can add another dimension, the media, of course, is selective. And you will know, and I think some of your viewers will be aware, that the very label Spanish flu is a result of the fact that the media in the countries which were at war in World War I rather played down the devastation of the Spanish flu, because they didn't want their enemies to know how disrupted their activities, their plans were. And as a result, when the flu broke out in Spain, Spain was a neutral country, there was no restriction on the press. And so perhaps quite imprecisely, inaccurately, the label Spanish flu was attached to the fact that, yes, we're getting reports from Spain and they are not being filtered out because of wartime censorship. And so there's a very, very powerful way in which the media shaped the very name attached quite inaccurately to this 1918-1919 pandemic.
There were actually even negotiations, if I'm not mistaken, how to name this disease. America and Italy, I have read, they would have liked to call it the German disease, maybe because Germany was besieged in World War I. I don't know if they had some information really proving beyond doubt that the virus or the pathogen agent originated from Germany, but at least we see the necessity to either from strategic considerations, not to have people panicking, or also not to show your enemy that you have some vulnerabilities. So rather playing things down.
Yeah.
One might compare this also to COVID nowadays. Given COVID is not a simple respiratory disease, because not everything flu-like is a flu, and COVID might be a severe neurodegenerative disease, then maybe in 50 years, historians will say that media was playing down a second terrible pandemic once more, claiming that COVID was a flu.
Yeah. And again, you're touching on one of those ongoing features of epidemics. As human beings, when we are faced with a risk, a danger, a threat, we want to know who is responsible. Where does this come from? And in the midst of a war, the most obvious response to say it's one of the enemy's tactics to try and defeat us. And that's exactly true. And enemy can often mean a military enemy, but you only have to just cast your mind back a little to HIV/AIDS, when the origin was identified as being gay men, because they were regarded as outside of the mainstream of society. So that's another example of finger pointing, of blaming some group who is not. It's never us, it's always them. But who the them are will depend on your existing prejudices, your suspicions, your beliefs that somebody or something or some group is wanting to harm you.
That's almost a philosophical approach to see that basically all cultures, irrespective of the fact if indigenous cultures or European cultures, they always are trying to point out with a finger at someone and blaming someone. Is that at a certain extent related to the idea of sorcery, that let's say something wrong within a society or within a tribe, a micro society, whatever may occur, is either of divine origin in terms of a punishment, or of a person doing wrong on another person? How would you see that?
Yeah, it really goes to, and that's again another example of shining light. It shines a light on cultural beliefs about responsibility, about why that age-old human question: why do bad things happen? Is it a divine punishment? Is it humans doing something wrong? Is it people who deliberately hate us? All of those are part and parcel of that array of ideas about why bad things happen. And indeed, as you say, within some cultures, the belief is that the ancestors are not really responsible for this kind of evil. It's not a punishment from some divine level. It's something which has been deliberately brought by those who are hostile to us. And certainly within many African cultural environments, that means that you look for the source of the evil in some other group who are wanting to harm you, to injure you, to undermine you. And that means it could be white settlers, it could be the government, it could be another tribe, it could be people indeed within your own community. But within that framework, it is very often the idea that those people have deliberately managed to get sorcerers or wizards or witches to harm your family or your community. And therefore, we need to, the word in South Africa is smell out those wizards, identify them, and once those wizards and witches have been identified, then you can identify who is paying them, who is getting them up to this evil, and punish them. It's a very complex array of answers to the fundamental question, why do bad things happen? That's human experience from the beginning of human time. Why do bad things happen? We need an intellectual framework to explain why bad things happen.
So, I mean, this happened, as I read in South African media also once COVID started, that some population groups blamed others for having brought COVID to South Africa. Have you seen there also elements resembling with the Spanish flu? Were there also various population groups blaming along ethnical frontiers,
yeah,
various opposite ethnical groups for the pandemic?
Absolutely, absolutely. South Africa, for better or for worse, usually for worse, is a treasure trove of social prejudices, as indeed probably most of the world, but I'm acutely aware of it here, in which an enormous amount of finger pointing happened. And so some Africans identified the white government of the time as deliberately wanting to exterminate Africans. Some white Afrikaners blamed English-speaking Afrikaners. I did say to South Africa is filled with a range of social prejudices. Blamed English-speaking whites for deliberately seeking war when they should not have sought war. Some said it's actually deliberately what you have done is you've enrolled some black soldiers to fight in World War I, and you're being punished for that. So the mind needs almost, there's no limit to the array of social prejudices which can be expressed in the midst of an epidemic. It goes back exactly, Radu, to what we were saying. It's an epidemic, a severe epidemic, is a stress test. It squeezes the society, and you see things coming out of the society which otherwise you might not have seen or you might not have wanted to see.
So we've spoken about sorcery, which actually excludes the concept of the consequence. What is the reason for something? So that's something actually rather bizarre. But now we may also look at the aspect of divine reasons for a disease. Yeah. So the last argument, which you mentioned, that Afrikaner, like communities in South Africa, blamed the English-speaking community of having employed African soldiers. So as the divine response would be punishing the whole community for having broken the law or rule of law.
Norms. Yeah.
So also something similar we have experienced, I must confess you, also in Europe, that some groups, for instance, believe that having, well, not broken divine laws, but at least having destroyed Mother Nature, particularly the reign of the animals, particularly the environment. So there is a response of the nature. Well, take it God or nature, it's more or less the same. It's also something divine, having caused severe damage to Mother Nature. In return, now a response of it is a severe pandemic as a sort of punishment. I mean, 100 years later, even highly civilized and, I shall say also, well, at least partly educated societies make use of the same arguments, don't they?
Yeah, in a sense, you can look, there's almost a continuum. There are enough severe pandemics in the 20th century to be able to monitor the change from saying divine punishment because we have been immoral or we've been guilty of some kind of a crime, and how that changes slowly over time, so that it is nature which has been transgressed, and as a result, nature is punishing the society. It's if we look over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries, you can actually mark that change over time. If you can indulge me for a moment, one of the approaches I had in the midst of COVID was to write an article putting into some kind of comparative perspective pandemics and responses. And what I chose to do was write an article looking at 3 major pandemics and how they were explained, not just in South Africa, worldwide. Cholera in the 19th century at the beginning, and then the Spanish flu, 1918, and then COVID, 2019. And indeed, it actually lines up, and I gave the title as follows: 17, 18, 19 explanations. And 17, 18, 17 was when cholera broke out in India. 1918 was Spanish flu. 2019 was COVID. And I looked at the changing way in which religion, organized religion, had explained epidemics. And not surprisingly, in 1817, the explanation was overwhelmingly it's divine punishment. And it tells us something about the societies, not just in Europe, but across the world. In 1918 Spanish flu, it's divine punishment, but there also are some who are saying it's more than that. It's because we have interfered with nature. And in 2019, well, you will think only a moment to species crossing the barrier, that it's animals. We've interfered with nature and with animals to such an extent that they've now taken their revenge. So it makes a very intriguing 120 years or so of looking at religious explanations and marking how they change over time. I found that for myself very educative, so that I was seeing links which previously I had not thought about, because I'd looked at one or the other and had not stitched them together.
So apparently a society's instruments and, well, tools or means to deal with the pandemic seem to be quite old-fashioned, don't they? Also the necessity to create a narrative as a way to explain the cause of a disease seems also nowadays as important as it seemed to be during the Spanish flu. Then you had various rumors. One part of the rumors claimed that the disease was of a German origin. There were other rumors as well. Nowadays, one is blaming a laboratory in China, both without any proof. But apparently, there's a huge need to give a story people could rely on. So again, we are dealing in modern times, we are dealing with very, very old instruments. Even though the challenge is enormous, the instruments seem to be the same.
Yeah, it goes, I would say, it goes back to that underlying human need for an explanation as to why evil happens. The explanation may differ depending on the society, the level of scientific knowledge, the level of cohesion. But the question which they're all seeking to answer is, why did it happen? And indeed, you'll go back, if you wish, to the time of Greece and Rome, and you'll find exactly the same explanation for great epidemics. It is either the gods punishing us, or it is that group of enemies. Déjà vu.
Well, could one say that, well, a society should be ready, or at least be prepared for all sorts of catastrophes and challenges? Was our readiness for another pandemic not that deep in our awareness? We're not that conscious of potential new pandemic? Is that the reason why we apply old instruments, or is that something which in a very stressful moment appears or almost occurs automatically or like by itself?
Yeah, well, again, I think it's a matter of what is available to try and counter the epidemic. And you will know, again, from the COVID experience, to begin with, there was no vaccine. We relied on isolation, on social distancing, on exactly the same quarantine as had previous centuries of epidemics. And indeed, sorry, you know the origin of the word quarantine?
It's 14, I guess, for the
40, because
40.
During the bubonic plague, those who came to Venice were put into isolation for 40 days because it was believed that if there was a disease, at the end of 40 days, it will have worked its way through all of those who were susceptible, and then the people on the ship could land. So that is very much part and parcel of a long-standing, almost basic, fundamental way of responding. But in 2020, you will know, with astonishing speed, quite unprecedented in human history, a vaccine was developed. Normally, vaccines take a very long time, decades, to be perfected. Yet with COVID, we had a vaccine of significant value in keeping the COVID at bay within a year and a half. That is extraordinary. That is without precedent. So there is a tool which had been worked on for a long time with other diseases and other epidemics. But when COVID came, the means to produce a vaccine was already available, and the technology was known. So in that respect, COVID is something which elicited a response which was infinitely different to, well, HIV/AIDS. There is no vaccine yet. Spanish flu, there was no vaccine. They didn't know what caused it, and further back. So in that respect, COVID certainly is a milestone of enormous proportions.
Well, let's have a look back, please, at the Spanish flu. South African authorities did quarantine soldiers who arrived in Cape Town. So they were kept there, I don't know if for 40 days or longer, but even after this time, they seem to have spread the disease and have carried the disease in the interior of the country.
Yeah. Here we can see another factor cutting across, and that is that these were soldiers in World War I who brought the Spanish flu to South Africa. And because of the priority given across the world to military needs, these soldiers were not quarantined for very long, and it was a very loose quarantine. Oh, well, you know, we'll just go through the motions. But in fact, reports at the time suggest that the quarantine really wasn't very restrictive at all. And so very quickly, they were allowed to embark on the troop trains to take them to their home because they were being demobilized. So here's a situation in which wartime needs, and the same is true in the United States very dramatically, the number of US troops who kept being sent across the Atlantic, even in the midst of the Spanish flu, was because the US military authorities said, we need troops on the Western Front. Doesn't matter that some of them may have Spanish flu. So here's a case where World War I and military needs trump the what one would call the medical wisdom of the time. And the same is true in South Africa. And so these troops travel along the railway lines, and almost poignantly, I found a railway map of South Africa. And on this, the railway authorities had written down the date of the arrival of one of these trains from Cape Town with troops, and then the date of the first outbreak. And poignantly, you can actually see 2 days, 3 days.
You could trace it back to that train.
Yeah, exactly. And those troops who scattered across the country and transmitted the flu high, wide, and handsome across the country. South Africa was one of the worst hit countries in terms of deaths because of Spanish flu. South Africa had a very extensive railway network, more so than almost any other country in Africa. And that's because of the needs of the gold mining industry. And that meant that the railway network was there, and these troops traveled along the railway network into deep, remote parts of South Africa and carried the Spanish flu much more rapidly than would otherwise have been the case if they'd not been on troop trains.
So the way the disease proliferated, it spread within the country, one can basically trace back to a modern infrastructure. That's one aspect. I also have read in your PhD thesis, there was a comment by a reader, a letter of her referring to the Spanish flu. I do not remember her name, but I do remember what she had said, that maybe the disease is far worse than what we got told. I don't know, how did practitioners perceive this disease? Did they accept that they were dealing with a flu, or they had themselves their suspicions that they might have been dealing with something worse than a flu, something very unusual, not resembling the symptoms of a regular flu?
Exactly. I think many doctors were totally nonplussed. This is not, they said, this is not flu as we understand it. This is something different. And particularly what caught their attention and caught the popular attention and fueled panic was that in many cases, because of the lack of oxygen, people with Spanish flu turned black, blue, and then black. And that many doctors said, this is not flu. Flu is something that you recover from after a couple of days. Maybe the elderly are most vulnerable, but the Spanish flu, and maybe this is something we should talk about briefly, the Spanish flu was most deadly to the fittest, youngest component of the adult population. If you look at the, and this is worldwide, if you look at the mortality profile, it's young adults between 18 and 35, 40, who overwhelmingly were the victims. Now that's not what flu does. Flu normally attacks, and if it kills those whose immune systems are running down, the elderly or the very young whose immune systems are still growing. Here we've got people whose immune systems are strongest, and yet they were the ones who in every country across the world were by far the largest number of deaths. That's not flu. So doctors were at a loss to know what to do. They did not actually know what caused flu anyway. In 1918, the existence of a virus was not yet known. Some suspected it, but it was not proven. They believed that, in fact, it was caused by a bacterium. So they were completely at their wits' end to know what to do. And indeed, for the medical profession, the Spanish flu is an utter defeat. There is nothing that you can draw out of the Spanish flu if you're a doctor, which says, here's a triumph of modern medicine. And this is medicine which, since the beginning of Pasteur and Koch in the late 19th century, believed that it finally had the answer to what causes disease and how to tackle it. Spanish flu blew that idea completely away. It's a depressing experience of inability to do anything. Let me just illustrate with one of the interviews which I did. I spoke to a man who was then in his 80s, but his father was a GP, and as a teenager, he had accompanied his father on his rounds during the Spanish flu. And he said to me with a tear in his eye and a choke in his throat, that was the first and only time that I saw my father cry. We went across the road to a young couple in their 20s, newly married, both with Spanish flu. And my father tended to them. He tried to save them. And then first she died, and then he died. And away from that, I saw my father with tears in his eyes at his inability to actually do anything, his impotence.
But were general practitioners aware these times that they were basically dealing or at least facing two concomitant diseases? The one was the influenza, and the other one was the lethargic encephalitis, a severe neurodegenerative disease. Or was this awareness later? What I have read is that Germany in the 30s, they've discovered a medicine against the lethargic encephalitis, which was the so-called germanin.
Yeah.
Surprisingly, this germanin is sugamine, a medicine, a medicament which is nowadays seems to have a beneficial effect against COVID. So I asked myself, a medicament which was administered in the 30s against this lethargic encephalitis, the sleeping disease, seems to help nowadays. Another interesting aspect is the German Minister of Health, Professor, is a medical doctor, Professor Lauterbach, has pointed out last year on a fact, he even published it on Twitter, that after COVID, we will be facing a new wave of lethargic encephalitis, this very severe neurodegenerative disease, like we did after the Spanish flu. So one might say that, well, what walks like a duck, flies like a duck, and walks like a duck must be a duck. There are some similarities which could be scaring. Why this second pandemic, the lethargic encephalitis, which was almost concomitant with the Spanish flu, might be rising nowadays? Where do you see parallels?
Yeah, I'm not a medical doctor, so let me make that clear straight away. This is really the comment of an interested, but not fully into the medical understanding. But what it looks like to me, and in South Africa, the encephalitis lethargica comes a little bit later. It's in the 1920s, not at the same time as the flu. But insofar as I know anything with regard, it seems to me that we might usefully at least apply that label which I used earlier about societies, stress test, to individuals as well. That someone contracting Spanish flu, their body, their physiology was subjected to a very severe stress test. And what it did was to show up the weaknesses, the shortcomings, the potential for further weakness, and intensify that. Now, whether that produced encephalitis lethargica, it seems to me at least worth asking the same question, because COVID has had a not dissimilar effect, put a stress test on the individual's body, on the individual's constitution, on the physiology, and perhaps might produce a similar to what the Minister of Health has said. So that's the comment of a non-medical researcher, but it does seem to me maybe it's worth examining, seeing that we've already used that concept of stress test, to use it not just for communities and societies, but also to take it at an individual level. Okay. Certainly in the wake of the Spanish flu, there were many cases of Parkinson's disease, of people whose cardiac strength was weakened, whose respiratory functions were weakened. All of these, one could suggest, related to having gone through this extreme stress test of the Spanish flu and survived it.
You have interviewed some people who had gone through the Spanish flu. And if you're now to compare what they've told you from their experience, particularly from a medical point of view regarding their sufferings, either if it was related to their memory or decline in their cognitive capacities or their lung function or their heart or even other organs. We are now talking nowadays about long COVID and rising cases of dementia in society, rising cases of Parkinson, severe respiratory problems with the lung, that the lung actually, once it was affected, in some cases with COVID, that it will have for the rest of the life this severe damage. Do you see any similarities, or have you ever heard about such long COVID symptoms in the 70s while interviewing some of the Spanish flu victims?
Yeah, those are the ones who told me about having had Spanish flu for the rest of my life. I had weak lungs, a weak heart. My memory was not as good as it had been. So, but this was largely anecdotal. It would be quite misleading to say that this is some kind of systematic gathering which I had made. But certainly, this is what I was hearing from people. Again, sorry, can I just tell you something else which crosses my mind now? More recently, some researchers in the United States have done, these are largely economists and econometricians. They looked at the life experience of Americans who were born during the Spanish flu. So that's, say, 3 months of 1918, and compared it with the life experience of Americans who were born earlier in that same year, before the Spanish flu, and in 1919. And what they came up with is that the life experience of Americans, of many Americans who were born during those, say, 3 months when the Spanish flu was at its worst, were significantly deficient in terms of education, in terms of lifespan, in terms of education, in a variety of ways. And they suggested, and it can only be a suggestion, that maybe the experience of being in the womb during the Spanish flu, when their mothers had contracted a mild form, had impacted negatively on their cognitive ability, on their, indeed, their lifespan. Now, if that's the case, and I'm afraid for South Africa it's not been possible, that kind of information just isn't available. But if that were the case, then indeed we're talking about a very significant long-term effect of having been in the Spanish flu, not yet alive, but in the womb. Now, there's a whole dimension which really suggests we should be thinking much more laterally about the way in which the Spanish flu impacted, not just on those who were already born, but those who were about to be born.
That brings me to another question, if I'm allowed, Howard. Howard, now regarding the awareness of the duration of the disease, were people expecting, Howard, to have the Spanish flu to be over very soon, or after a certain moment they said we will have to live with the virus, like we got told nowadays that most probably we'll be living with a virus and have to cope with a virus for the rest of our lives?
I think here's a difference. The Spanish flu, the virus, was so vicious that it swept through the society very rapidly indeed. And if you contracted it and survived, you had a degree of immunity against, indeed, there were 3 waves in 1918, 1919. It's very clear to me that if someone was able to survive a bout of Spanish flu, then at least short term, they had some immunity. So that astonishingly, during the worst month or 6 weeks of the Spanish flu, it swept through the society, particularly South Africa, but elsewhere. And then so many people had contracted it, either they had died, or if they had survived, they then had a degree of immunity. So it was of relatively short duration. Indeed, in South Africa, it was given a popular label, the 3-day sickness. If you survived 3 days, then generally you would be able to survive and recover. It was of an intensity and of a severity which COVID has not been, thank goodness. It is really something which was so virulent that it either killed you or struck you down and gave you some immunity.
Were there also people who had contracted the Spanish flu several times, like people getting COVID several times, or you only once had it and that's it? You either survived or you died.
Yeah. That short-term immunity was sufficient to prevent contracting it a second or third time, at least in the case of South Africa.
Now, what about the government? What can you tell us about the government? There was, I guess, no medical department. Was it a duty of the army or of the police to enforce various measures of protection? What was the government's perception? Did they want the people to calm down, to prevent any panic? What could you tell us?
Yeah. Let me give you a little bit of background. In 1918, South Africa was still a very new unified state. It had been unified only in 1910. So it had only limited state departments, and there was not yet a department of public health. There were a couple of doctors plus 3 secretaries who made up a little sort of subdivision within government. So there was no overarching Department of Health, which meant that it largely devolved on local government, on the city councils, on the town councils, on the village management board to try and do something. And largely it was they who set up relief centers, temporary hospitals, provided food, provided some kind of hoped for medication. So it really was earlier on, stress test. It showed up enormous, the glaring gaps in the South African state. And not surprisingly, as a result, in double quick time, in 1919, South Africa passed its first Public Health Act to set up a Department of Public Health. They had been talking about it for a couple of years, but, we'll come to it. Eventually we'll do it. The Spanish flu accelerated that rapidly, so that the consequence was already in 1919, South Africa had its first Minister of Health, its first Secretary of Health, a first State Department. If we look now for the COVID, South Africa is in the midst of debating, and has been now for quite a number of years, to pass a National Health Act, a National Health Insurance Act, to transform the very, very deficient current South African public health system. And here, unusually, I will make a little bit of a forecast. Usually I'm better dealing with the past, but here I will say that I think almost certainly within the next 3 or 4 years, there will be, with everyone saying COVID showed up, the glaring inadequacies of the South African public health system as it stands at the moment. We must repair that. We must redress that. I would say that it's almost a certainty that this legislation will go through. There's a nice parallel, 1919 and 2022, 23, 24, something like that.
There are stress tests for banks, there are stress tests for nuclear power plants, and the benefit of the stresses is to have a better performance. One may hope that this very unfortunate stress test in form of a pandemic with all its victims may at least have one positive impact in assuring a better and a more professional working of the public administration. How do you prepared a text, a song text for us? Unfortunately, we cannot play this song in this interview, but it's a song going back called Influenza to the 30s. And I'd like us to tell you, I'd like you please to tell us some things about having readjusted a South African, a famous composer, Philip Miller, having adjusted this old song to present times. And I'd like you to read us the text of the song and tell us the story about the composer and the song.
Yeah, let me actually, if you will allow me, tell you how I stumbled upon this. I was interviewing an elderly woman in her late 80s during the collection of oral evidence, and we were talking, and I was asking her, what do you remember about World War I? And she had some memories as a young woman of World War I. And then she suddenly started singing a song. This was in KwaZulu-Natal, and the interview was in isiZulu. I had an interpreter. She started singing a song which started in 1918. There was a flu. I said, what's that? What's that? And she says, this is the song which we used to sing. In fact, here's the extract from the interview. In 1918, there was a disease spread throughout, known as influenza. It destroyed the young and old. So out of that, they composed this song. This song was sung throughout. Few people know it now, but I remember it. Here are the words. And let me give you the English translation and then tell you about how Philip Miller came to adapt this. I'm sorry you're not able to listen, because it's a poignant lament composed by a young Zulu composer who was he had his own choir, and he wrote it for this choir, and it's his experience. In fact, he wrote it in 1919. It was recorded when he went to England with his choir in 1930. But this is the original song called Influenza by Ruben Galuza. That's the composer's name.
Sorry for interrupting you, ladies and gentlemen. Since we are unable to play this song in this interview, I encourage you and highly recommend you to listen on YouTube to Ruben Galuza and Philip Miller to the song Influenza. Then you get actually the perfect understanding of what Howard will be telling us now about this composer and the song.
Yeah, the original is in isiZulu, so here's the English translation. In 1918, an influenza epidemic spread like wildfire throughout the country. It took with it many lives. Our beloved mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers died. At some homes, not a soul survived. Beautiful daughters, handsome sons, bonny babies, engaged girls, and newly married couples, all passed away. Old and young perished, and darkness ruled over all the earth. Parents left their young ones uncared for and in great grief. Nevertheless, it was so with those who went to Canaan. Despite the hardships they experienced, they persisted in praising and magnifying the name of their Maker. Therefore, youth, let not your hearts be troubled, for there is no complete happiness. It is well, I can hear, as I'm reading it, I can hear that tune, that sad lament. It's a very powerful evocation of the grief and bereavement at the loss of life, particularly of young adults who you'd expect to live longest in the Spanish flu. And for me, when I heard this song and then had the translation given to me, I thought, this is such a powerful remnant of the Spanish flu. And I was able then to actually track down a copy of the score, of the musical score. And I found it tucked away in a library somewhere. And when, during COVID, I was interviewed by a journalist, I mentioned this to him, that I had in the 1970s found this lament about the Spanish flu. And he has a friend, the current South African composer, Philip Miller. And he approached Philip Miller and he said, do you know about this song? And Philip said, I've never heard of it in my life. And then Philip said, you know, there are many young members of my choir now, singers that I know, who are without work, who can do no singing, who can get no jobs. I'm going to rewrite this music for a 21st century audience, and we will play it and hope that it will draw contributions. And so if you go onto YouTube, you'll find his reworked version. It's the original tune, but a little modernized, of this original Ruben Haluza song. And here, right at the beginning, you were saying to me, what is it like to have written about an epidemic and then live through one? Well, here is a song which was written in the middle of one epidemic and has resurfaced more than 100 years later in another song. For me, it connects, it ties together the past and the present in a very, very formidable way indeed.
One can almost hear the melody by having this very accurate description of the moments, this very warm words related to the composer and to the text. Though we're not listening to the song now, but one could imagine this incredible lament. And I can recommend all of you, ladies and gentlemen, to listen to this song. And also congratulations to you that you had once more such a merit in dealing at least with a new aspect of a pandemic, with the musical aspect. So music is something unifying, I think, particularly for you in South Africa of the 70s, having dealt with a song from the African population was maybe during apartheid not something very, very usual. So that's something extremely impressive, I should say.
Yeah. In fact, I've coined the little phrase as a result of this: memory in melody. That in melody there is memory to be gained, and as historians we should remember that as well.
Howard, thank you very, very much for having joined us here in Outlook. Thank you for these details. I hope that, ladies and gentlemen, having spoken to Howard helps you to look at the similarities and also to calm down during such a critical phase and not to become a victim of a stress test. To take a stress test as a stress test, as a test, but not to have a too stressful time.
Yeah. Thank you indeed, Radu, and thank you to the viewers.
Best regards to Cape Town, all the best, and have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye, Howard.